I am Charlotte Miller, 34 years old, and the creative director of a rapidly growing design firm in San Francisco. My job keeps me at the intersection of innovation and strategy, blending creativity with the hard demands of the market. I thrive on challenges, taking brands and transforming them into something unforgettable. And yet, every year there's one challenge I can't seem to overcome: my family. For as long as I can remember, there has been an unspoken understanding in our family. The ones who truly matter, the ones who belong, are those who fit a certain mold. My parents, both successful in their own right, have built a life of connections, power, and influence. They are experts at curating their inner circle, and year after year I am left on the outside. Each time the family retreat rolls around, I receive the same message: "Sorry, darling, not enough space for you this year." The wording is always polite, but it has become a ritual, one I've come to accept. This year, though, something in me shifted. I had long stopped questioning why. After all, I had learned to succeed on my own terms, far beyond the limited understanding my parents had of success. Yet, even with my growing portfolio, my increasing recognition in the industry, and my relentless work, there I was again, left out. Then I saw it. A social media post, something innocuous at first glance. A photo of my family's itinerary for the retreat. 150 people. Family, friends, business partners, everyone. Except for me. The realization hit hard. It wasn't a mistake. This was deliberate. And in that instant, everything I had silently accepted over the years came crashing down. It had been 2 weeks since I saw the photo of the retreat itinerary. 2 weeks since my family's disregard for me became a glaring reality. The feeling was still fresh, gnawing at me like a wound that couldn't heal. Yet, I knew better than to let the anger consume me. It wouldn't do any good. It never had. The truth was, I had spent far too much of my life trying to gain approval from people who would never see me for who I truly was. And now it was time to stop playing that game. I had always known that my path didn't align with my family's expectations. After all, I had made the choice to go into design, not finance or law. Not something safe and predictable. I had fought for my place in a world that constantly told me I didn't belong, but it had taken this latest incident, this blatant exclusion, to make me realize just how long I had been tolerating something that wasn't just wrong, but unfair. I didn't want to confront them directly. That would only lead to more conflict, more empty apologies, and nothing would change. No, this time I decided to take a different approach. An approach they wouldn't expect. I wasn't going to beg for a seat at their table anymore. I was going to build my own. I spent the next several days in relative silence, keeping my thoughts to myself. I continued with my work at the agency, meeting clients, brainstorming new ideas, and overseeing projects. But in the back of my mind, I was focused on one thing: creating an event that would not just demonstrate my value, but also prove that I didn't need my family's validation to succeed. I began by researching locations, something unique, something that wouldn't just be another retreat, but an experience, an event for people who appreciated the work I did, people who understood that creativity wasn't just a hobby or a fleeting passion, but a lifestyle, a commitment, a calling. I wanted to create an environment where like-minded individuals could come together, collaborate, and celebrate creativity in its purest form. But it couldn't be just any venue. It had to be perfect, an escape, a place where people could disconnect from the chaos of everyday life and focus on what truly mattered. I spent hours looking at different properties. Some were too big, too impersonal, like they belonged to corporate events rather than a space for something authentic. Others were too small, too hidden. But then I found it, a private retreat by a lake nestled in the mountains. It had everything I needed: peaceful surroundings, stunning views, and enough space to accommodate the kind of event I had in mind. It wasn't as grand as Lake Tahoe, but it was beautiful in a way that felt real, untouched. The next step was planning the event itself. I needed to create an itinerary that would not only engage people, but also inspire them. Something that would make them feel that they were part of something special, something that would be remembered long after it was over. I knew exactly who I wanted to invite: friends, colleagues, fellow designers, artists I had met over the years, people who shared my passion. These weren't just acquaintances. These were the people who had always supported me, who had seen the work I did and respected me for it. They were the ones who understood the sacrifices, the long hours, the moments of doubt, and the victories that came in small, quiet ways. The logistics were more complicated than I had anticipated, but I was used to that. Planning an event was nothing new. My experience in managing projects for clients had prepared me for this. I secured the venue, then worked on gathering the resources I needed. I coordinated with chefs, photographers, and facilitators, people I knew personally, people I trusted. Everything needed to be flawless. I wanted this to be something extraordinary, something my family would never be able to overlook. I carefully chose the workshops and activities. They had to reflect the diversity of the creative world. Photography expeditions at dawn, journaling sessions, hands-on art workshops that pushed people to explore new mediums. I wasn't just hosting a retreat, I was curating an experience, one that would leave a lasting impression on everyone who attended. But as I pieced everything together, doubts crept in. As what if it wasn't enough? What if I'd made the wrong choice? What if the whole thing turned out to be a disaster? I kept those thoughts at bay. I couldn't afford to let them in. I had worked too hard to get to this point. Too many years of trying to please people who would never see me as more than a disappointment. I had learned the hard way that their perception of me didn't define my worth. It was late one night when I made the final decision to go all in. I finalized the guest list. Grace, of course. She had been there since the beginning, supporting me when no one else did. Then there were the others. Designers and artists I had collaborated with, clients who had turned into friends, people whose opinions I valued. Each one of them represented a part of my journey, a part of who I had become. I added a few more names, people I had worked with on projects over the years but hadn't seen in a while. This was about more than just filling seats. This was about creating a space where I could belong without having to fight for it. I had everything set in motion. The website was up, the invitations were sent, and the countdown began. My heart raced with excitement. This was my moment, and I was going to make it count. But just as I thought I had it all figured out, one last piece of the puzzle fell into place. I remembered my family, how they would react when they found out. They would undoubtedly question why I had gone to such lengths to create my own retreat. They would wonder why I hadn't just accepted their invitation, why I hadn't tried harder to fit into their world. But that was the point. I didn't need their approval anymore. I had built something that was mine, something real, something that honored who I was. And when they found out about it, it wouldn't be about showing them up or getting revenge. It would be about showing myself that I was enough. So I pushed aside the nagging voices in my head and focused on what lay ahead. The retreat was only a few weeks away, and the pieces were falling into place. I was ready, and I knew this would be the beginning of something much bigger than just a weekend getaway. This was the start of a new chapter in my life, a chapter I was writing for myself, on my own terms. The days leading up to the retreat were a blur of preparation. Every detail, every aspect of the event was carefully planned. The location was secured, the guest list finalised, and the activities, everything from the photography hikes to the pottery workshops, were locked in. Everything seemed set. Yet the closer it got to the event, the quieter I became. People in my life noticed, of course. Those who were involved in the retreat were buzzing with excitement, asking questions, checking in. But I found myself responding less and less. I had always been the one who thrived on the energy of others, who enjoyed the hustle of creative discussions and deadlines. Now I felt strangely distant, as if everything around me was happening in slow motion. Maybe it was the weight of what I was about to do, or maybe it was just the calm before the storm. But there was something unsettlingly quiet about my demeanour, something that no one could quite put their finger on. At the office, things were business as usual. My clients didn't notice the subtle shift in my focus. I still delivered on time, still made sure the projects moved forward. But my mind kept drifting back to the retreat, the grand idea I had set into motion, the one that would serve as my statement, my way of saying I don't need your approval to be successful. I couldn't help but wonder, deep down, if that was what I truly wanted. I had spent years shaping my career, my identity, around this notion of acceptance, of finding a place in a world that never fully embraced me. Now I had built something that was mine, something independent, and yet I couldn't quite shake the feeling that I was still seeking something I hadn't yet found. The truth was, part of me wanted to see how my family would react. Would they notice? Would they finally understand what I had been trying to show them for all these years? Or would they continue to brush me aside, as they always had? I didn't know, but I also didn't want to. There was a strange peace in knowing that, whatever happened, I was doing this for me. The days passed, and with each one, I grew more resolute. I would not seek their approval anymore. I couldn't. Not when they had made it so clear that I wasn't worthy of it. Not when they had relegated me to the outskirts of their carefully curated world. I had my own world now, and I intended to live in it fully. But there was something else, something I had not anticipated, the emptiness of it all. The realization that, despite the carefully crafted event and the thrilling anticipation, I still wanted my family to see it, to see me. I wasn't naive enough to think it was about winning their affection. I knew that wasn't possible. But I did wonder if they could simply recognize what I had done, what I had created. I wasn't trying to prove anything to them anymore, but a small part of me couldn't help but wonder if I was silently hoping they would notice. I didn't tell anyone about this internal conflict. Not Grace, not even the people closest to me. There was no need. I didn't want to talk about it. I had set my course, and I knew that discussing it would only complicate things. Instead, I buried myself in the details. The music for the welcome dinner was chosen, the chefs confirmed, the photographers lined up. Everything was coming together in a way that felt too perfect to be anything but right. And yet, despite the surface-level calm, there was a low hum of tension in the back of my mind. I found myself staring at the retreat's website late into the night, tweaking the layout one last time, perfecting the wording. It wasn't just about making everything look beautiful anymore. It was about something deeper, something more primal. It was about control, about finally taking control of a part of my life that had been slipping through my fingers for too long. I didn't expect the retreat to be perfect. Life wasn't perfect, and neither was I, but it had to be real. The idea of spending a week surrounded by people who valued what I did, who appreciated the work I had built for myself. It was more than just a break from the chaos of my family. It was an affirmation that I had created something meaningful, something that mattered. As the days ticked down, I continued to manage the final details with precision, but inwardly, I began to feel like I was walking a tightrope. The moment when I would send out the final invitations to my family felt imminent, but I hadn't yet decided if I would. In some strange way, I wasn't sure I wanted to give them the satisfaction of knowing what I was doing. The thought of their dismissive response made my stomach churn, and yet I knew I would have to face it eventually. At night, I would sit in front of my computer, staring at the screen, the cursor blinking in the silence of my apartment. The messages from my siblings, from the guests attending the retreat, they all came in at once. Everyone was excited, eager to be a part of what I was creating. It made me smile, but there was something else creeping in, something more unsettling than I was willing to admit to myself. A part of me still wanted them to be a part of it, even if they didn't deserve to be. But I kept my thoughts to myself. I couldn't afford to let doubt in now. Everything was moving forward. The retreat would happen, just as I had planned. I would make it happen. The only question left was whether or not they would ever understand why I needed to create this space for myself. Would they ever realize that this was not just a business venture or an event, but a reflection of who I had become, of everything I had been through to get here? I didn't know, but I was about to find out. The retreat had arrived and everything was in motion. The guests had started trickling in one by one with their bags and eager smiles. I greeted each of them with a calm composure, masking the quiet storm that had been brewing inside me. My mind, however, was focused entirely on the details, the schedule, the workshops, the meals. It was all going exactly as planned, but in the back of my mind, I couldn't shake the anticipation of the inevitable shift. By the time the last guest had arrived, I could feel the weight of the moment. The house was buzzing with energy. the atmosphere thick with the anticipation of the experience I had promised them. Everyone was engaging, laughing, connecting, and yet, in the midst of it all, there was a part of me, quiet, reserved, that still observed from a distance, watching the world unfold around me. It wasn't that I didn't want to engage, it was simply that this was my creation, and I was determined to let it take on its own life. The first evening passed in a blur. The sun set over the lake in a glorious display of orange and pink, casting a peaceful glow over the retreat house. As I looked around, seeing my guests immersed in conversation, laughter echoing through the rooms, there was a moment of silence inside me, a moment of realization. This wasn't just an event, it was a statement. It was everything I had ever wanted, everything I had ever fought for. And yet, deep down, I couldn't help but wonder how my family would react when they found out. Would they even care? Would they understand? I had planned it meticulously. The retreat wasn't just a success, it was a bold declaration of independence, a step toward carving out my own place in a world that had never fully welcomed me. And as the evening wore on, my phone buzzed relentlessly. Messages from my family. They had seen the Instagram posts. My mother had noticed the pictures. The others had seen the stories. Slowly their awareness began to take root, but none of them had come to me directly. They weren't here, and in some strange way that felt like a small victory. The next morning, I found myself standing on the deck, watching as my guests embarked on their first morning activity. A sunrise yoga session led by David, one of the participants who happened to be a certified instructor. The view over the lake was breathtaking, and I could see people stretching their silhouettes against the soft light of dawn. It was surreal. This thing I had built, this world I had crafted, was exactly as I had imagined. I didn't need them to see it. I had created something real, something meaningful, something entirely mine. But then the calls began. Blake texted first. "The place looks incredible. What is this about?" There was no anger in his message, no accusation, just a curiosity I hadn't expected. But I knew his question wasn't just about the venue or the event. It was about me. He wanted to know why I had done this, why I had chosen this path, why I hadn't just accepted the family retreat. But I didn't respond. Next came Amanda, who simply asked if I knew anything about the retreat and why Heather wasn't with her at the family event. There was a defensive tone in her message, but it didn't faze me. I had expected that. The truth was, I didn't need to explain myself anymore. The messages continued, but I remained unfazed, my attention focused entirely on the retreat. I couldn't allow myself to be distracted by their expectations. I had taken a step that none of them could have imagined, and I was determined to see it through. The afternoon passed in a similar fashion, busy, fulfilling, and productive. My guests were engaged in workshops, and I was doing my best to stay connected with each of them, ensuring that the experience was as rewarding as possible. But I could feel the weight of my family's reactions hanging over me. I knew they would continue to watch from a distance, maybe even try to figure out what had motivated me to do this. But I had already made my peace with that. This was mine. By the evening, things began to shift. I had finished a conversation with a client about a new project when I noticed my phone buzzing with multiple messages. Brian had sent a text. "Saw your posts. Looks amazing. Didn't know you were planning something for this week." His words weren't laced with malice. There was an almost tentative tone to them. Still, it felt as though there was more beneath the surface. It was Blake who showed up the next day. Unannounced, he appeared at the retreat, clearly unsure of what he was stepping into. When I saw him standing on the porch, his face conflicted. There was no anger, no accusation, just a sense of unease, a quiet acknowledgement that something had changed. Something had shifted in our relationship. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected me to take matters into my own hands, to claim something that was mine, to step into a world where I no longer needed his or anyone else's approval. I didn't confront him. I didn't need to. Instead, I showed him around, introduced him to some of the guests, and let him see for himself. I let the space, the people, the events speak for themselves. I didn't try to explain why I had done it, what my motives were. There was no need for that anymore. It wasn't about him or anyone else. It was about me. As the day wore on, the tension was palpable. There were conversations happening, side glances exchanged. I saw the way Blake interacted with my guests, how he was drawn into the conversations, how he seemed to find comfort in a world that was so different from the one my family had always wanted me to inhabit. There was a subtle shift in him, a shift I hadn't expected. I saw the old version of him, the curious, engaged person who used to spend summers playing on the docks with me, the version of him that didn't just follow the rules of the family, but created his own. But I remained calm. I didn't feel the need to confront him. I didn't feel the need to explain. I had already made my decision. This was my retreat, my world, and I had built it from the ground up. I didn't need validation from anyone. That night, as the guests sat around the bonfire, laughing and sharing stories, I realized that this moment, the one I had created, the one that felt so real, was more powerful than any family gathering could ever be. I didn't need them to see me anymore. I had created something of my own, something that couldn't be undone. And yet, as the evening drew to a close, I couldn't shake the thought that something was beginning to change. I had always been the one to fight for a place in the family, but now they were fighting for a place in my world. The days following the retreat were a blur of new messages, new connections, and a quiet shift in the air around me. I had anticipated that there would be questions, maybe some confusion, even criticism, but the reality was far more nuanced. Slowly, as the retreat's impact began to ripple outward, I found that something unexpected was happening. It started with a few quiet conversations. Word had spread, of course. People talked, shared pictures, mentioned the experience they'd had. The retreat had not just been an event. It had become a space where genuine ideas were exchanged, where connections were formed, and where creativity had been allowed to flourish without restriction. At first, it was subtle. One of the photographers posted an image on their social media with a caption about how refreshing it was to be part of something authentic. A well-known artist had written a glowing blog post about the creative freedom they felt during the retreat. Slowly, these small things began to build into something larger, something undeniable. Then came the calls, invitations from potential collaborators, clients, and peers who had seen the retreat and heard the buzz surrounding it. They weren't just offering opportunities, they were offering respect. My inbox, once a place of professional requests and tedious negotiations, was suddenly full of messages from people who were genuinely interested in my work, in my vision. One particular message stood out. A prominent design magazine had reached out, asking for an interview about the retreat and the philosophy behind it. They wanted to highlight the retreat as an example of how creativity could be fostered in unconventional spaces. But it wasn't just the business world that took notice. It was the people who had been in my life for years, who had witnessed the struggles and the small victories, who began to see me differently. There was a shift, subtle but undeniable, in the way people interacted with me. They weren't just acknowledging my success, they were acknowledging me. For the first time, it felt as though I wasn't merely being tolerated, I was being seen. The surprise came from my family. My father, who had never been one for expressing emotions, sent me a text. It was short, matter-of-fact, but it carried weight. He mentioned how he had heard about the retreat from one of his colleagues and how it had been impressive. There was no apology, no admission of wrongdoing, but there didn't need to be. His acknowledgement was enough. It was more than I had ever expected from him. I could feel the shift in the way my parents viewed me, not just as their daughter, but as someone who had done something of value. The walls, which had been built over years of misunderstandings and dismissals, began to show the first cracks. As the weeks passed, the retreat became a point of reference in creative circles. A new conversation was taking place, one that was focused on substance rather than status. My own career trajectory, which had always been about proving something to others, was now about creating meaningful work. I wasn't chasing approval anymore. The opportunities that came were not because I had begged for them, but because my work had spoken for itself. In the midst of this, I found myself reflecting on what had changed and how much of it had happened without my control. I had always sought validation from others, whether it was from my family, my colleagues, or the world at large. But now I found that my worth wasn't something to be earned or proved. it simply was. The retreat had been a catalyst, yes, but it was not the defining moment of my success. The shift had begun long before that, perhaps without me even realizing it. The most profound change came from within. The retreat had been a stepping stone, a way to move past the doubts and the years of questioning my place in the world. But now I realized it wasn't about what they thought or how they viewed me. It was about who I had become, how I had transformed my own sense of purpose. I had created a space for myself, one that I didn't need to defend, one that was simply mine. And in doing so, I had learned to embrace the quiet confidence that comes from knowing exactly where I stand in the world. The success of the retreat, the recognition, the new opportunities, it wasn't just about business. It was about a deeper, more meaningful kind of recognition. It was about being seen for who I truly was and not who others wanted me to be. There were still challenges ahead, of course. Life, as it always does, had its ups and downs. But for the first time, I felt that I was exactly where I needed to be. The retreat had changed the narrative. It had shifted the balance in ways both small and profound. I didn't need to prove anything anymore. The world, and more importantly, I had begun to see the value of what I had created, not in grand gestures or declarations, but in the quiet, steady growth that came from truly understanding my worth. The next chapter had already begun. I wasn't looking for it. It was unfolding, one step at a time, in the subtle, unspoken way that success often does. I didn't need to look back. The work, the recognition, the sense of fulfillment, it was all moving forward. The path was clear. And for the first time in a long while, I was content to simply walk it. The days following the retreat had a peaceful quality to them. I had received my fair share of attention and praise, but there was no joy in it that I could describe as a victory. It wasn't about winning or showing anyone that I had been right. It was something else, something quieter, deeper, a recognition that had come from people who mattered, who understood, who saw the value in what I had done. Not just in the retreat, but in every choice I had made leading up to it. My phone still buzzed occasionally with messages. Some from colleagues, some from new acquaintances who had attended the retreat, others from those who had read about it online. But one stood out. It was from the editor of a respected design magazine, inviting me to share my story in an upcoming feature about creative innovation and leadership. They wanted to know how I had transformed my experience, how I had built something from nothing, how I had reclaimed my space in a world that never truly gave it to me. I hesitated for a moment, not because I didn't want to share the story, but because the story was no longer about me. It was about the work, the people, the connections, and the realization that I didn't need to be defined by anyone else's limitations. The invitation felt like an acknowledgement, not of what I had overcome, but of who I had become. Someone who had quietly, steadily, and confidently made her mark. The article was published a month later. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't about drama or triumph. It simply told the story of a woman who had decided to carve out a place for herself despite the odds, and in doing so, had created something that touched others. The responses to it were unexpected, people reaching out to thank me for being honest, for showing them that they too could build something on their own terms without waiting for permission. My family too had begun to shift. I wouldn't say they came to me with open arms, but there was a subtle change in their tone, in the way they spoke to me. My father, for the first time, acknowledged my success without a hint of condescension. It was small, but it was there. My mother sent me a note, a handwritten one, which felt more significant than any apology could have been. She spoke of how proud she was of my work, and while we never addressed the past directly, it didn't feel necessary. I had done the work. They were beginning to see me. I continued to build my business, but now with a sense of peace. There were still moments of doubt, of course. There always would be. But now I knew my worth was rooted in something deeper than external validation. It came from the confidence of knowing I had made it on my own terms, and that alone was enough. One evening I stood on the balcony of my apartment looking out over the city. The skyline stretched in front of me, but there was no sense of yearning, no feeling of being left out, no desire to be anything other than who I was in that moment. I had spent so many years trying to fit myself into a box, into a family mold that never fit. Now I had created my own. Success, I realized, wasn't just about recognition. It was about the quiet moments when you can look at yourself and know that, despite everything, you have found your place. It was about understanding that no one else's view of you could define your worth. It was about knowing that, in the end, the world would bend to you, not the other way around. The story I had written for myself wasn't one of revenge or vindication. It was one of self-acceptance. And as I looked out at the city, I knew that the journey wasn't over. It had only just begun. In the end, I had learned that true strength lies not in proving others wrong, but in improving to yourself that you have the courage to live life on your own terms. And that, in itself, was the greatest victory of all. As I reflect on the journey, it's not the loud moments of triumph that stand out the most, but the quiet realization that comes with owning your story. To be excluded, dismissed, or overlooked, it's a painful experience, one that leaves its mark. But in the end, it's not about fighting for validation from others. It's about finding the strength to validate yourself, to stand firm in your worth, even when the world seems to say otherwise. The retreat wasn't just an event. It was a turning point, a way to prove, not to anyone else, but to myself, that I didn't need anyone's approval to be successful. And in doing so, I created something that others could appreciate, not for the sake of revenge, but for the simple, undeniable value of authenticity and growth. In the quiet of those moments when everything else had passed, I realized that true recognition comes not from seeking it, but from earning it in the most subtle of ways. And sometimes the most profound victories are the ones that happen within ourselves. So when you're faced with adversity or exclusion, ask yourself, how can you turn that moment into a testament of who you truly are? Sometimes the most powerful change comes not from others, but from the quiet strength within you.